December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
On December 7th, a surprise military attack on Pearl Harbor was launched by the Empire of Japan, the following events of which lead to not only the most egregious but deplorable injustices committed in American history: the mass eviction, relocation, and detention of hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans. As of the 1940s, the presence of Japanese communities in the United States had been growing for more than 5 decades. Almost 1/3 were immigrants, the majority of whom settled on the West Coast and had been living there for a considerable number of years. However, despite being long-time inhabitants of the country, the unexpected strike on Pearl Harbor, which directly led the United States to join World War II, also unfortunately led to anyone with Japanese heritage to be looked at suspiciously, in spite of there being no evidence hinting towards sabotage. Deep-seated racism had been prevalent in the country for years prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. But as a result, Japanese persecution was further increased, especially by many non-governmental entities. Press outlets such as the Hearst and McClatchy newspapers wrote provocative editorials and news columns that created a sense of outrage among Californians towards their Japanese American neighbors. Writer Henry McLemore wrote in one of his public columns,
"I am for the immediate removal of every Japanese to a deep part in the interior. I don't mean a nice part of the interior either. Herd him up, pack him off, and give him the inside room in the Badlands. Let him be pinched, hurt, hungry, and dead up against it. Personally, I hate the Japanese, and that goes for all of them."
Although a few brave commenters, such as Milley and Walt Woodward, pushed for fair treatment and defended Japanese American rights, stating,
"There is the danger of a blind, wild, hysterical hatred of all persons who can trace ancestry to Japan. That some of those persons happen to be American citizens easily could be swept aside by mob hysteria."
But their voices were largely overshadowed by the racism and hysteria propagated by the press and media. The reaction by several people was to discuss the eviction of all Japanese Americans from the western states. Many government officials encouraged the banishment of Japanese Americans. In the discussion of these brutal measures, one individual stood out as the leader of the campaign: Lieutenant Colonel John L. DeWitt. He rashly argued that the fact that Japanese Americans had not yet committed sabotage was proof that they were secretly planning to do so in the future. In 1942, DeWitt and others urged President Franklin D. Roosevelt to expel all people of Japanese descent from the western states and imprison them elsewhere. Roosevelt ultimately agreed. On February 19, 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It ordered the roundup of 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry to one of 10 internment camps. Over 2/3 of the Japanese who were locked up were American citizens. The vast majority had never even been to Japan. Americans who were as little as 1/16 Japanese were forced to evacuate their homes. The announced basis for the government policy was military necessity, which meant that Japanese Americans were considered a security risk because there was no way to determine their loyalty to the country. Soon, evacuation orders were posted in Japanese American neighborhoods, with very little time to evacuate, leaving them to only carry what they could with them. The Japanese inhabitants were outraged, confused, and saddened. Many sold their belongings as quickly as possible, uncertain if they would return to find everything still there. After the orders, they were first kept from leaving their homes or neighborhoods. The government froze bank accounts and imposed local restrictions such as curfews. Then they were held in temporary centers, such as stables or at local racetracks, generally having no idea where they were being sent, until eventually being contained in the camps. Japanese Americans were now alienated from their country, both socially and physically. In August 1942, the Japanese internment had begun. These were not the death camps of Europe, but they were complete with barbed wire fences, guard towers, searchlights, and armed military guards. The incarcerees were held in barracks, made of very cheap material, and had no plumbing or cooking facilities. They were too cold in the winter months and too hot in the summer. Not even all families were kept together, with some being sent to different camps. Food was rationed out at a cost of about 45 cents a day. The United States government hoped that Japanese Americans could grow their own food. However, the conditions were too poor for growing crops for the camps as they were located in isolated deserts. The government also failed to provide adequate medical care. Many fell ill and were unable to receive proper treatment due to the cramped and overcrowded unsanitary areas. Nonetheless, in the face of hardship and uncertainty, many inmates showed remarkable resilience and determination, finding ways to preserve their sense of community and normalcy, creating makeshift newspapers, schools, and churches. However, not everyone was content to simply endure. Many brave individuals rebelled against the injustices they faced, organizing labor strikes and protests at great personal risk, displaying instances of civil disobedience, with some individuals refusing to answer loyalty questionnaires. These acts of defiance took many forms, including the 1942 sit-down strike at the Santa Anita Assembly Center, which marked a bold challenge to the authorities. Out of the many camps spread across the United States, over half had some form of riot or revolt. The most infamous incident was the Manzanar riot of December 1942. Following the arrest of a cook, 3,000 inmates protested, forming a sea of people, and mercilessly, military police fired on the crowd, killing 2 and wounding 10. These revolts occurred not just inside, but outside of the camps. The most notable case is one of a brave man named Fred Korematsu. Korematsu was a Japanese American living in California prior to the internment camps. After his family left for the camps, he stayed behind, became a welder, and tried not to stand out, even changing his name and getting a fake ID. However, eventually he was caught and put in federal prison. Shortly after, the ACLU reached out and offered to represent him in court, together arguing that Executive Order 9066 directly violated the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment. He went through many stages to eventually appeal to the Supreme Court, who agreed to hear the case. They compared it to a previous case called Hirabashi v. the United States, which ruled in favor of the executive order. The court sided with the United States, claiming Executive Order 9066 was justified and essential to America's safety. They said, the need to protect America from espionage was more important than individual rights. The decision was certainly controversial among the judges, with a vote ratio of 6-3. One of the judges, Frank Murphy, who dissented, notably said,
"The decision was basically the legalization of racism, and this racial discrimination went directly against everything the United States stood for."
Korematsu v. the United States goes down as one of the worst court decisions in our history. Finally, in 1945, the United States won World War II. President Harry Truman canceled Executive Order 9066, and one by one, the camps were shut down. 3 years in the camps, and several months after the war was finally over, they were freed. The emancipated Japanese Americans were given $25 and a train ticket to return to their former homes, only to find them either looted or destroyed. To compensate for their property losses, the United States Congress passed the American Japanese Claims Act, but in reality, the law did not compensate for much of what was lost. Many were outraged and felt cheated and wronged. Post-war influence made finding work difficult. People were met with discrimination and racism from workers who had replaced them. Those of older age found it next to impossible to rebuild their lives after the war. Change had to be made, so the people took matters into their own hands. Children of incarcerees began a movement calling for the United States to atone for the injustice committed by Order 9066. They needed reform to be had. Their struggles eventually led to the government's public apology in 1988, a whole 43 years later, claiming the catastrophic event was due to a combination of racism, hysteria, and failed political leadership.
Japanese Americans of the 120,000 who were relocated or detained. Yet no payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor.
And in 2009, after the death of her late father, Karen Korematsu founded a non-profit civil liberties organization called the Fred T. Korematsu Institute, and it is still currently run by Korematsu's daughter. As of today, not many know of the wronging committed in the United States during the Second World War. The misery that ensued was a tragic reminder of the devastating consequences of xenophobia and the dehumanizing effects of internment. But the people can be educated on the bravery shown by so many and the bigotry of those of higher status. It shows how we can learn from our past mistakes and right the wrongs of the people who were well aware of their true intentions, and how it was a personal betrayal to the principles upon which this nation was founded, leaving a legacy of injustice.